And how do can I make one point? I think for the people on Zoom, we have people on Zoom, is that right? I think we need to be using the microphones if they're to hear us. So anybody who's presenting or taking the floor. Okay. Time, I don't have the time. You'll tell me. Should we stop? Okay, thanks everyone. Can you hear me? Is my mic on? Yes? So hello, I'm Natasha Palmer. I'm from Queen Margaret University. And what I'm going to do now is talk to you about the first part of the work that we did, which was the global level interviews. And as Carl has already said, we took a kind of political economy lens across all of our work. So this presentation tries to give a bit of a setup of the whole picture which we're going to look at today, and then get into some of the findings that are more specific around power and interrelationships at the global level. So first slide, please. So I think we had a very interesting time doing these interviews. Obviously, there are a multitude of different views and reflect on this topic, but I still think that there are some very clear themes that have come out. I think it's important to say this system is very dynamic and it's quite contested. There are lots of different initiatives and reforms, and it's a huge field which is moving very fast. So I think these interviews give a picture of things that are being said at the moment about this area. I think a challenge for all of this work is how to draw boundaries around the different fields. So we are looking in particular about the role of the global health initiatives, but that overlaps, of course, with issues around how to support countries to achieve universal health coverage and the broader ecosystem which the global health initiatives are part of. Next slide, please. So we did 78 interviews between, about 3 or 4 of us were doing the interviews. We did 78 between late March and early June. I think that Carl has already presented the breakdown of who they were, but I've just put here the numbers of the different actors that we talked to. And what we asked people were around likely challenges that the global health system will have to face over the next 10 to 20 years, because I think that that is the focus of our work, is how things should evolve and what the role of global health initiatives should be over that time period. We talked about what they saw as the strengths and weaknesses in the current ecosystem and how power and interests align and disagree at the moment. We talked about what we could learn from previous proposals for change and previous initiatives for change, some of which have already been mentioned, such as the IHP. And we asked about how global health initiatives can and should evolve and what a better ecosystem would look like. Next slide, please. So I think, first of all, it's important to try and reflect on the role of global health initiatives and where they sit within the wider ecosystem. So the next couple of slides are just setting up some sort of basic picture of this field that we're going to discuss today. So, of course, first, just the bigger picture, the context that we're all working in at the moment. We talk about the golden years of global health, and I don't know whether we feel that we're coming out of them or whether we hope we're still in them, but it's important to acknowledge how much resources and how much movement has been made over the last couple of decades. So I think there's an interesting figure here about how much resources grew during the decade 2000 to 2010, from 7 billion to 27 billion in development assistance. There have been huge disease-specific gains, and we now have affordable access to medicines and technologies that were really unimaginable in the early 2000s. And I think it's really important to say at the beginning of this meeting that the GHIs have been really key in a lot of this, and that there have been tremendous gains in things like vaccination rates, reduction in childhood mortality, and so forth. But I think also it's very clear that the fundamentals of the current model are being questioned. That domestic funding is still low, and there are fears that the current system is crowding out domestic financing for health. the way in which development assistance for health is delivered is seen as very distorting. It's too short term. There are lots of transaction costs. It's highly fragmented and complex. And I think everyone is well aware of a lot of those issues here. I think another problem is that there is no clear vision for transition or sustainability over the next decades. And some elements of this system are still seen as being dominated by the global north. People about what they thought the next 10 to 20 years would bring, and I'm afraid this is a bit of a sobering slide. There's a long list are going to be challenging the health systems of countries in the next couple of decades. Firstly, this climate is going to increase health challenges and put pressure particularly on some regions and states. The environment is increasingly unpredictable and polarizing. And these two are very likely to lead to increased migration. We're already seeing hugely increased migration, but that will probably increase further and protracted humanitarian crises as well. Then from the health side, we can expect to see, and I know that the country case studies will all talk about this, changes in burden of disease at country, communicable diseases coming up, and then probably some new pandemic diseases which are still here. So on top of that, we would expect all of that to increasing inequality within countries and also between countries. So I think it's fair to say that there will be economic growth, and some countries hopefully will be able to move towards globalization. That's one path which we can discuss today. There is another path which we have to acknowledge, which is increased fragility for some other countries. We expect the flows of development assistance for health from what we're calling the traditional sources to probably decline, to at least stabilize. There may well be increases from new sources, but those are an unknown at the moment, and we don't know what direction they will go in or what kind of political and economic ties they will bring. This is getting much more complex, fiscal space is hard, and structure to so many more different actors than in the past. So that's our kind of context, which we have to think about over the next 10. It's important. I suppose it's important because we need to have health systems that are going to be able to adapt and react to all of these different things. So we need to be able to have flexibility and resilience built into systems. Next slide, please. So I thought it was worth, again, just at the beginning of the day, putting up a bit about who these GHIs are. And I've put up here a sort of bubble that roughly represents the annual budget of each of them. I think this is a good point to flag that it's actually quite hard to access good detailed information about how much they're spending every year. I mean, in fairness, this is not their spend, this is their budget or the money that they're asking for. It's also quite hard to access where it's being spent and what it's being spent on. And there's definitely gains that could be made in that area, just as a basic thing to flag. So you can see here that the Global Fund and Gavi are by far the biggest. And I think it's also important that in all the conversations we had, they probably took up proportionally that amount of airtime. So I think a lot of what we're talking about today probably does relate most closely to the two of them. And this is also because they're funding country operations directly. So again, of course, there's much more kind of interaction between them and lots of other actors and players in the system. I've got the global financing facility in the middle there, and I think important to flag that it's the figure I've put there is 2 billion, which is their trust fund, and they use that to try and loans. So they're not making grants, they're making loans, and they're sort of public financial management systems. And then the last three GHIs, UNITAID, CEPI, and FIND, are really different, and we're calling them the sort of global R&D GHIs. And they don't work widely at country level. It's more funding R&D through different channels. I think final thing to flag is that they all work on the idea of a replenishment model, and that's definitely something which has come up in the interviews that we did. Please. So probably all quite familiar with the this list of advantages and challenges of GHI. I thought it was important to just put it up here, and these have all come out of the interviews that we did, so they're quite current. I think the advantages fall in. One is that the GHIs have done a very good job delivering on particular targets, of being clear of the money has been spent, on increasing access to services, and they tell a very good story about the work that they've done. Accountability functions to their donors. I think it's debatable whether they do the same to countries. But I think that those three first advantages make them a very attractive proposition for bilateral donors. The bottom three bullet points are equally important, I think, and have been stressed a lot by respondents in the interviews. They've been very good at mobilizing civil society. They pay attention to marginalized groups in all countries. And where government isn't necessarily working in the interests of those groups, it's possible for them quite easily to channel money outside of government in a way that maybe some of the other development actors are not able to. So I think that's been their keys over the last 20 years. Then we turn to the challenges. Budgets keep increasing, and as I've mentioned, there isn't really a convincing transition strategy yet, so that only raises questions of where do we think that this is going to head. There are many examples of how they've been arguments and services in countries and between countries, and the manner in which money flows is probably distorting. They're increasingly moving into the space called health system strengthening, and I think it's being flagged that this isn't that, and they're all it. They increasingly, which I think is difficult for donors, and there is a tendency, which isn't really so much their fault, but there's a tendency for GHIs to proliferate, and for the ones to, and all of that leads to overlapping functions which are very difficult to manage at country level. I think they have developed governance structures which seem a bit unwieldy, and there are some quite big power differentials within governance and elements of capture by different groups of some of the governance structures. We wanted also to just have a quick acknowledgement of their place in the ecosystem. So I've listed here the main actors who would interact with GHI, active in a very busy and interconnected landscape. I think important to flag that they act both as a recipient of funds, but also as a major funder of many of these other actors. And so when you get into the political economy of this system, you see the kind of roots and branches are very, very interconnected. And finally, I think it's important to flag that there are others in this ecosystem. And I think that many people we spoke to started off by saying we can't talk about the GHIs in isolation. We have to understand them in relation to the other actors. And I think that to some extent, it appears that their rapid rise is partly a reflection of some weakness in some of the other actors. And also what we're calling their mission creep, that they're moving into new areas, is also partly a reflection of that. In particular, the role of in-country support and coordination was flagged by many different stakeholders as weak and contested within countries, whether that is the role of the World Bank, the WHO, the Ministry of Health. Often it's not being performed very well, and that also gives space for more confusion and overlapping functions, which isn't necessarily the fault of the GHIs, but then seen as a kind of powerful actor within that kind of rather weak space. And I think finally, people have talked about a sort of vicious circle where as GHIs have become more dominant and powerful, that has contributed weakness in other actors. And many people talked about the role of WHO, and opinion was quite divided there. There were opponents of putting more power into the hands of WHO, and there was opinion divided over what its role is and should be in the coming years. This is just a quick graphic to show, it's a nice paper which did a social network analysis of different global health actors. You probably can't see it, but in the middle is the Global Fund, and it shows it is one of the top 10 in terms of interaction with other stakeholders, funding, etc. So these institutions have taken a which is now very important to understand. Okay, so now the next section, we're going to talk a bit about the different actors and really how interests lie at the moment and what the narratives for change were in the interviews that we did. So we wanted to understand where power is because we think that that's quite important in order to know where things are low in the next few years in the absence of change of direction or a different evolution. And we thought that power really breaks down into three key components when you look at it in this context. And that's shown here in this sort of circular diagram. I mean, around the edge, you've got financial power, which is obviously, in the case of these types of organizations, the ultimate power. But there are other types. There is technical power, which I think is going on in the organization and what the organization is doing. And then governance, which sits between the two, and I would say is really trying to decide what the organization should be doing. And we looked at the way that governance is taking place through the lens of those three types of power. I think people were pretty unanimous in saying that ultimate financial power, so the sort of holding of the whole ring, belongs with the bilateral donors and the Gates Foundation, that they wield the main power in this system. But at the moment, they're not coordinated, they're quite divided, and so that means that that power may not always be exercised as well as it could be. The GHIs and their secretariats, meanwhile, are quite good at mobilizing political lobbies and therefore capturing a bit of control, and they've been quite effective in resisting change. Overall, we thought that there was insufficient voice for and accountability to countries in these structures, and the whole function is suboptimal. And at the moment, they're not really technically strong for the. So I think they've been set up for a previous set of challenges. And as this presentation shows, these challenges are changing quite quickly, and boards haven't really kept up. There was one quote which stayed with me throughout this work, which said that they were perfectly calibrated for, and I think that that's something which was really backed up in many of the other conversations we had. And then if you look across the GHIs, so at governance between GHIs and across them, I think, again, it's evident that there's a lack of coherent coordination across these governance structures. So how often do these different boards and their members talk together? And the fact that that doesn't seem to be very frequently exacerbates fragmentation and maybe allows missionizations. And again, we thought the voice of countries was diffuse across these different boards and could be strengthened. So then we talk, there are a few more comments on this slide, which is really just going a bit more in actors. And I'm going to talk again about the donors. I think, as I've said on the previous one, they weren't seen as acting as one, and that weakens the power that they're able to wield at the moment. It's well recognized that they set up different initiatives that they can control or to change a focus, but this does lead to the proliferation problem of GHIs. And I think that the GHI are confounded by the speed with which new institutions are being set up. And that really does sit with the donor community. I think the domestic politics of some bilaterals is a challenge, and it can make them short-termist and quite unpredictable at the moment. And finally, they're not very clear health system strengthening and how. And I think at the moment it feels like a bit of a fudge. So we have vertical health system strengthening. And again, I think many people are not very convinced by that structure. Countries have had an incentive not to rock the boat and to work around the system up until now. But I think it's a question for this group of whether this is really changing. And the civil society groups that are included in the current GHI governance mechanisms tend to just represent specific issues and interests. So we're only really, I think against all of that picture, it's important to say that the FGHIs are highly inventive, and they're constantly evolving and trying to reinforce their own roles. So then we looked quickly at the lessons from previous initiatives. There have been many initiatives in the past to improve alignment and coordination. And in fact, when I looked at a few of them on the traveling down here, you feel, wow, you know, this is really, many of these points have been made before. And they were not argued with. These previous initiatives had lots of legitimacy, and the principles that they put forward are still seen as strong principles. But we don't think that they really had much gain. Maybe they made some small marginal gains, and the question is why? Their aims were good, so we believe that the problem lies in implementation. And I think that the lessons maybe that we've taken from this is that initiatives led by a small number of donors are likely to be ignored or to fizzle out, or they could just change when that donor changes or politics in those countries changes. Initiatives that are voluntary and agreed as a compact are quite easy to term. And so therefore they need teeth, and that would probably mean considering structural change. And finally, donors and countries need to be the ones driving that structural change, because there are no incentives for GHIs or other actors really to change. So I'm going to quickly go through the kinds of things that were said around change. I think generally across our interviews, it's accepted that evolution of this status quo is desirable. And I think that that came from many or most bilateral donors and also many people working within GHIs. Financially, this is seen as probably not sustainable if replenishments continue to grow as the overage shrinks. The current model is not working for countries and becoming politically quite difficult, and there's increasing noise around it. And epidemics, because the burden of disease analysis, and we'll present some of that later, no longer ties up against the way money is focused. Important to flag that change was not seen as including creating another GHI or some sort of super GHI to monitor and wait what the other GHIs were doing. And also that the three smaller GHIs who are more involved in R&D and things around global public goods were rarely called out in the same way. And I think the questions there are more around efficiency and overlapping mandates rather than a sort of bigger picture. The speed and depth of change required was more nuanced. I think there are some voices we've heard which would like to move very, very quickly towards very radical change, but I think that the donors and the global health initiatives mentalist approach. Next slide, almost there. Narratives for change. Given that this work really is put within the kind of cradle of UHC, it's important to bring us back to that and say, well, what is needed in order to actually deliver UHC more? And I think we'll hear a lot more about these themes as the day goes on. There's either by grants or a move to financing. And this funding needs to be adequately reflected on budget or the equivalent. If it's not going to be on budget, it should at least be declared clearly to ministries of health and ministries of finance. It needs to be more aspects of achieving universal health coverage, and it can support, therefore, institutions. I think that there's a sense that we really need to acknowledge the different paths that countries may be on, and approach countries that are in transition or that are agile with a more nuanced kind of approach and flexible set of support. And finally, country-led alignment and control must be enabled. And a lot of people talked about the need for a common M&E framework, which includes accountability upwards back to the funders. So not just seeing what is happening at country level, but also understanding where money has gone and what that money has achieved. Finally, all of the above involve a trade-off between longer time horizons and immediate results. And I think one of the things about the GHIs is they're built on this model of sort of quick time horizons, very panicky programming, panicky spending, everything is a panic. Next slide. Okay, and these are the final narratives for change, which were about the GHIs. And sorry, my slides are not very glamorous. Shows things which really happen quite quickly. I think the first thing around governance is aimed at the fact that they need to set up some sort of way of having a better dialogue between them Secondly, on replenishment, there were calls, very strong calls, I'd say, to move away from this staggered, separate, competitive replenishment model, months receiving a call for a replenishment for a different GHI. So ideas around whether they could do a pooled replenishment, or if not that, at least try to get onto a similar timetable so they all happened at the same time. And I think there were clear calls to reconstituency across the GHIs. And then in the longer term, there's interest around regionalism. In terms of financing and mandate, again, as I've said, funds must be placed on budget by all clearly. And then the other areas there, I think, are more long-term, about aligning more clearly with country needs, being flexible for country programming, less focus on grants, perhaps moving towards concessional finance, which would lead into domestic resource mobilization. Funds was raised by many. Finally, in monitoring and accountability, please can we have joint indicators? Can people sign up to the same indicators? Can we use country-generated data? Perfect, but the act of using it will help to strengthen it. And clearly report the amount of money that's on budget, and also other money which may not be on budget, where it's going. Pause there, because we're now going to just very briefly talk about the online survey. We had 45 respondents, anonymous. A group of people who responded were academics, GHIs and CSOs. Really very, very similar issues were raised. In particular, questions around whether we could experiment with pooled funding, issues around health system strengthening, and the responsibility of donors and boards to clarify the mandates and collective goals of the GHIs. So rather than repeat all that, I put a couple of quotes from the survey because I think that they also really well encapsulate some of the things that were said in the interviews. So one quote is to ensure investments in country assurance mechanisms and public financial management that will allow for greater donor confidence, greater autonomy for countries to self-determine within governance frameworks that reward these countries ready for reform. And then the second one is the role of GHIs needs to be considered in the context of its mandates and the roles of other actors in the system, in particular WHO and the World Bank, HSS and the global health architecture. I'm going to pause there. Sorry if I've gone over. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Natasha. So what I would suggest is that I would take maybe a couple of questions for clarification. So if there's something not clear, we will keep some time after the full presentation, after the 3 country case studies, to open the floor for comments and questions. But just a couple of questions not clear, you would like clarification. Okay, so let's move to South Africa and Professor René English from Stellenbosch University, who is going to present the South African case study. Is it ready? Is it ready? Okay, there's a good news. We have the coffee is ready. So, René, is that okay?
Yes.
Huh? Should we grab a cup of coffee and back? So let's go now. Yes? In maybe 10 minutes maximum. Okay? What about you? So for people online, we come back at in 10 minutes. Thank you very much. It's unmanageable.
We move straight away. Why? Okay. Ah, that's mine. Hello? No. This. Hello? Yeah.
Is voice
Testing.
I think Renee's sounds okay.
Hello, hello, hello. Okay, yeah, okay. So for the French-speaking experts, please do ask your questions in French, and we're here as well to translate as much as possible. We can see you at the breaks as well to explain the key messages. On peut expliquer tout ça et on peut traduire. Et vos questions, vous pouvez les poser en français. Il n'y a aucun problème. D'accord? On est là pour vous aider. Vous aider à traduire certains aspects. D'accord? Okay, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. As was indicated, my name is Renee English. I'm from South Africa, and I would like to acknowledge the rest of the team whose names are on the slide. Before I start, I'd also like to work builds very much on the presentation that themes across it. And so I want to reiterate some of the points. I'd merely just build on some of the points. Thank you very much. Next slide. So the case study that we had done, we conducted a number of key informant interviews as well as an online consultation in country. We can move the slide. Okay, we just have some problems with the slides, but I'll continue. Displays, you'll be able to get a sense of how many people. We had 24. Thank you. Next slide. Oh, a little louder. Okay. So South Africa is a middle-income country. We are considered the most unequal country in the world. We have a population size of 60.6 million people and a life expectancy at birth of 62.8 years. What you can see on the slide is evidence of the 52 health districts that we have. Our health system is structured the National Ministry of Health, and then we have 9 provinces, and each province has their own provincial Department of Health, which then oversees a number of sub-districts. We're driven health system, primarily nurse-driven, and we have just under 4,000 primary health care facilities in the country. Next slide, please. As you can see, in terms of mortality and disease burden, South Africa is characterized by what is called a quadruple burden of disease. We drive the burden of disease within our country, as well as a number of other communicable diseases. But what we can see is trends over time between 1997 and 2018 is that non-communicable diseases have been driving in terms of the percentage of deaths. Injuries and violence also contribute significantly as one of the contributors to the quadruple burden of disease in country. Next slide, please. What this slide illustrates are the changing trends in the 10 leading causes of years of life lost between 2010 and 2017, and really builds on the TB remain the leading causes of death. But what we are able to see, if you can just press the thank you, is the increase in CVS as well as diabetes mellitus in terms of leading to years of life lost in our country. So certainly an epidemiological transition is what has been observed over the past few years. Next slide, please. And what the slide illustrates as well is over a period of 10 years, we can see the shifts in risk factors that drive most of the death and disability combined with behavioral risk factors and metabolic risk factors being key. And this also speaks to the role of the social determinants of health and other factors that drive burdens in our country. Thank you. Next slide. So the global health initiatives which are operational in country are the Global Fund, CEPI and UNITAID, GFF, and as you can see from the slide, South Africa has been a donor to Gavi since 2007. So in terms of Global Fund, it is the leader in terms of contributions made by GFF. A leader in terms of the contributions that are made towards it. We also receive for the COVID-19 response, as well as the traditional fights to countries. It's important to note that it is the second largest donor in the country and contributes about 7%. FIND is in country. It collaborates with a number of partners and directly funds them for doing work within the range of disease focus, as is presented on the slide. And similarly, CEPI is in country and supports van technology and other transfer activities. And UNITAID partners with South African institutions, and the disease focus is presented on the slide. Next slide, please. So in terms of our key health financing indicators, South Africa spends about 15% of its total government expenditure on health. And the annual total health expenditure as a percentage of GDP is greater than expenditure, 54%, from the private sector, 38%, and out-of-pocket expenditure estimated to be 7%, which then leaves the rest for donor funding. According to our nationals, about $660 million is contributed by donors every year to our government fiscus, about 4 to 5% of annual government expenditure on health, which is what it's estimated to be. In terms of contributing to the disease programs in South Africa, Global Fund FGHI contributing about 536 million, as can be seen, with most going to HIV and the rest to TB programs primarily. Thank you. Next slide. This is the different contributions as a percentage of total health spending for the year 2017 towards various diseases within the country. So government towards HIV and AIDS, TB and malaria. As we can see, about 80% of the funding for HIV and AIDS is from government. The development assistance for health is mixed, with about 16% contributed towards HIV, AIDS and TB, about 26% towards, HIV and AIDS, and then 26% towards TB and about 2% towards malaria. Important is a significant partner in South Africa, funding HIV primarily, about 6 billion rand or 268 million US per annum. It's important to highlight that a substantial portion of funding by development assistance for health bypasses government and goes directly to organizations, primarily non-governmental organizations, TSOs, with very little going to our provincial departments of health and even less going directly to other subnational levels. And this amount is estimated. So what this map illustrates, and it's a very busy map, so I won't summarize it, but what I do want to show is that there are a broad range of actors who are part of the landscape in terms of either being part of the donors, decision makers, or recipients, as is illustrated on the slide. And this builds very much on the work, as I said earlier, that was presented earlier in terms of getting of the landscape of the actors and who hold power and the position. GHIs, their board members, their donor countries, or their funders or supporters are considered by the key informants within our country to have very high power. And similarly, some aspects of it is considered to be having less high power, should I say. And this is primarily because South Africa doesn't rely as much on within Africa. Government has a very big say in what engage within the countries. And that's why there was a decision that the powers are not necessarily very high in terms of the mapping. Next slide. The South African government, there is a coordinating body known as the South African National AIDS Council that has a lot of power and decision and is funded by Global Fund, and they're said to have medium power, making decisions around particularly global funding, for global's funding, are considered to have medium power and have a lot of interest and enthusiasm for the roles of GHIs in our country. But communities, patients, and poorly resourced provinces and districts and sub-districts and some higher education institutions within our country are considered to have very low power in terms of the decisions that are made with regards to GHI funding. Thank you. Data that's come from the key informant interviews, but I'd like to highlight that overall across the board, there's a great appreciation for the work of GHIs within the country. Doubted that the work that had been done, particularly in the early years of the HIV and AIDS epidemic in South Africa, has been responsible for the observed improvement within the mortality indicators of antiretrovirals and the ongoing support. And so I will now move to some of the challenges, however, that was also thematic areas around programmatic and health system. It was felt that the focus of the GHIs were too narrow, given the shifts in epidemiology that the country faces, structural health systems challenges that have emerged over time. A very strong theme that was identified was that of fragmentation and duplication. And across the levels in the health, we interviewed from the level of the ministry, whether it was the treasury, the presidency, right down to the provinces or the civil society organizations, is a sense of fragmentation and duplication despite the positives linked to either misalignment with some of the country needs and the shifting epidemiology, as I'd indicated earlier, or it was due to the